किनु फूल दसा दुख दर्द सैयो.
Today we have Dr. Sumangala Damodaran talking to us on protest music. Thank you for agreeing to talk to us.
Yeah.
So, first question to you would be, how would you define protest music and how do you see the protest music? By saying that, I mean the protest music that was a part of the Marxist cultural movement in India, and how do you see its legacy today?
Yeah. Well, if you're asking me for a definition of protest music, I don't think I want to define it.
Right.
Because perhaps attempts at definition are something that have actually stifled the whole notion of protest music. And I'm saying this because that really has a relevance to the contemporary. So what really comes out if you look at a broad history of protest music, even from the early 20th century onwards, is the fact that it's very difficult to define. But at the same time, if you look at it from the point of view of how protest music has evolved as part of the history of cultural movements and political movements, often it has been the attempt to try and define it in a particular way that has resulted in a certain kind of a stifling of the concept. So I don't want to define it in any way. Having said that, however, there is, I believe, a definite genre of music which we can call protest music. And so it's got a hugely varied history with a lot of common elements. What perhaps is interesting is that one can actually trace lineages, connections across societies and across time within societies as well. So which makes it a genre which needs to be understood carefully, and it's also something that needs to be understood from the point of view of its contemporaneity and its importance in contemporary times.
Now, you just mentioned about the lineages that one would be able to find in terms of protest music. When, let's say, one is looking at India, one would find or would want to find linkages between various states, now what we call states in Indian subcontinent. So while archiving these kind of songs and music, A is, what are the challenges that you faced, and B is, how do you think they were related, or what were the common themes that were running in these songs that you managed to archive?
Well, I have archived a particular tradition, which is the IPTAS tradition, and I'm calling it the IPTAS tradition, which is so it's not just the music of the formal organization called the IPTA, but also of allied organizations which had different names in different parts of the country. So, so it's a very specific thing that I have looked at, but and it is something that came out of the anti-colonial struggle, but something that also continued in organizational form as well as in terms of the idea, much beyond independence. And of course, there is the IPTA exists in various forms in different parts of the country today too. Now what is distinctive about the IPTA is that, first of all, that it was perhaps the first time that protest music or theatre, for that matter, was being thought of at a national level, bringing in all the different local, provincial levels, so to that extent it was trying to imagine a nation, and for obvious reasons, because it was actually it was germinated in the late colonial period. So links are obvious between different parts of the country, different kinds of cultures and subcultures and so on. So because it was a national movement, but which had a lot of local and regional segments, organizationally as well as in terms of how the politics of it emerged, this particular organization, or this tradition as I'd rather call it, was thinking concretely in terms of linkages. However, it's not that the idea of the protest song or protest music has always thought about it in linkages. So there are parts of the country which have actually created protest music which are totally rooted in very, very specific traditions, which don't necessarily look at it in terms of
Could you just
linkages.
give us an example?
So there is music that comes out of specific Adivasi movements, for example, which doesn't try, and this is because of the nature of the political movement at that particular time, which generates that music, which doesn't really try to actually look at it in terms of how it might sound outside of its context necessarily. So it is responding very often in terms of what is being created from within that context itself, what is historically important from that context, and so on. So I mean, I don't want to take specific names, but there are a whole range of very localized movements which create music and various forms. I mean, dance, for example, dance forms which are rooted in very specific contexts and which are not attempting to create linkages. So there is a combination of all of that, and the IPTA itself, in fact, was an assimilation of a lot of these kinds of movements in different parts of the country, but it was also trying to go beyond just the local.
Because I think there were themes which were anti-fascist and anti-imperialist also, which ran through at least the theatre part of it, and even the songs also that IPTA produced.
Yeah.
And as you said that possibly they were responding to the immediate political urgencies that were erupting in various part of India. So if we think that say pre-independence these themes were anti-colonial or let's say anti-establishment and to some extent pro-people, what happened after independence? And what happened to the songs after independence? What would be the themes that one would find in post-independence songs of IPTA?
Well, there are breaks as well as continuities. So one, that the fact that a lot of the music came out of an anti-fascist politics, the anti-fascist movement, or the anti-colonial movement did not mean that the way in which the fight against fascism was being looked at or the fight against colonialism was being looked at was only in specific historical terms. It was actually in terms of the systems that create either fascism or colonialism. And to that extent, therefore, even after independence, it was possible to translate that very politics into a post-colonial agenda. So for example, if to be specific, the IPTA, which created a lot of theatre, music, dances, which were anti-fascist in nature, got converted into the peace movement songs in some sense. So in that sense, there was a continuity. Similarly, the anti-colonial productions that came about were already beginning to imagine that the post-colonial state might also be repressive. So one of the first things that happened by 1948, in fact, was the IPTA's role in actually talking about the Indian state as emerging to be repressive. So there were continuities, but then the breaks were also part of a larger politics and not just as responding to specific events that happened at particular points of time. Although the responses were actually happening to events. Okay, but the way in which a lot of the cultural productions unfolded were not reflecting a politics that was only immediately contextual.
These songs were, or generally researchers term them to be the popular songs of the era of the IPTA, the people's song or the mass song, or even the word in Bengali we say it Gono Shongit, the Gono becomes very important in these songs, right?
Right.
So how do you see the notion of popular in these songs, and how do you think it has, because you still sing these songs, and what are the responses that you get while singing these kind of people's song today, when the notion of popular is completely different from what it was during the IPTA years?
Right. Well, the idea of the popular comes from the people, right? And what I would say is that the most common interpretation of the popular that you have, particularly in India today. So, for example, in Indian academia, in most cases, when you say popular, it is usually referring to commercial. So, you have popular cinema or you have popular music, and it refers to, either commercial cinema or commercial music. The people actually being defined in terms of the consumers, whereas a larger notion of the popular, and which is what Gramsci has actually referred to as the culture of the popular classes, actually talks about the people not only as consumers but also as producers of that culture. And I think more fundamentally, the idea of the popular as the shaping of the popular imaginary. Now, the shaping of the popular imaginary happens not only through the market. The market is a very, very significant component of the shaping of the imaginary, but the very fact that there is an imaginary that is being shaped. So, to that extent, what organizations like the IPTA were doing, or popular movements were doing, and I would say continue to do, is to actually try and shape the popular imaginary, where more restrictive notion of the popular is that's something that's commercial and therefore accessible to millions of people, is only one part of the idea of the popular. But now this is how the popular is talked about in Latin America quite extensively. Okay, so when you say popular, the first thing that people would say would be of the people, but somehow we seem to have lost that connection. And yes, so the producers of protest music, whether it was coming from traditions that people sort of had, or it was being crafted consciously, in response to a political event, it was an attempt to actually not only reflect a popular imaginary or what popular traditions, but also to shape that imaginary. And to that extent, therefore, something like the IPTA, an initiative like the IPTA, needs to be looked at as playing a very important role in how the popular imaginary panned out in the immediate pre-independence and in the post-independence period. So, for example, whether it is in the cinema or in terms of a lot of forms of entertainment that emerged in post-independence India, a lot of these ideas actually came from the IPTA. The whole idea of having a cultural program with different kinds of different kinds of art forms being displayed,
representation from various part
of the country and so on, was really pioneered by the IPTA. Now there have been sort of static and mechanical interpretations of that, which is our variety entertainment. But the idea that an audience could actually be shaped by putting across a lot of these kinds of different forms is something that is the attempt to craft that imaginary.
Very important point that you brought up was the popular imaginary. So, as I was asking you, when you sing these songs today, how do you think this imaginary works in today's world?
I have a couple of things to say about this, which is one, that the themes have repeated, in the sense that if you were singing about famine, there's been no dearth of famines after independence. If you were singing of war, there's been no dearth of wars, violence, and so on. So so that's one thing. So the continuities
of the themes
has actually made it possible to immediately actually sing historical songs contemporaneously, without necessarily having to think too much about it. But I think it goes beyond that, because what is it that would make it appealing today? What is it that might actually evoke a response which is of the contemporary, but with an appreciation of something that was created in a historical period? And I think that really is the challenge for someone who chooses to work with an old archive, but at the same time it's also something that it's something that is easier to do with the kind of tradition that we see with an organization like the IPTA, because it involved such a huge range in terms of forms, in terms of the ideas that were being explored through music, in terms of
I think mass participation also.
Yes,
right?
yeah. So there was such a huge range that it is possible to actually try and find what might fit into our context. But what I found is that that's not actually been so difficult. So it's not. Of course, there is the need for interpretation, and the interpretation can be very minimal. You don't even need to completely overturn how song sounds. You just need to perhaps emote it in a way that is contemporary, which reaches out to the audiences of the present. These were actually creations that were amenable to this, and that perhaps demonstrates the richness of a tradition, and which is also because of the kinds of minds that engaged with it. So here were these tremendously talented artists who were trying to imagine what it is that a new India should be like, what it meant to talk about transformation, emancipation and so on, and how, more importantly, how that actually gets reflected through music. So what is it that you can bring into a tune, what kind of form can you use, what kind of instrumentation can you use, which can actually convey that. So when that has already happened, it perhaps, with an appreciation of that process, it becomes not so difficult to interpret it in contemporary times, which is what a lot of people have been doing, in fact. So those who are interpreting the Sufi tradition from the 18th century are contemporaneizing it, not necessarily by actually making it sound completely different, but by being able to relate the ethos of that time with the needs of the contemporary. So it's not been so difficult, and audiences respond very, very positively to songs on famine, for example.
Do you remember anything that you would want to share about audience responses that you have come across?
So for example, I have found a lot of songs on the Bengal famine, and I have also sung those songs. They are songs that were written about a specific event, okay, or a particular period in India's history which was very traumatic, and also which embodied a great deal of politics. So, and they were often songs that were actually referring to specific incidents that happened, and so on. But it hasn't been difficult after explaining the background of those songs to actually immediately make reference to something like the farmers' suicides that have been happening, or hunger for that matter. And this has happened across different kinds of contexts, among college students, among in sort of poor settlements, in auditoria. It does seem to immediately appeal, and actually also make people respond to historical events as well with emotion, and not just as historical event. So the Bengal famine actually is a very, very important event that, if you look at it in terms of the cultural productions that it produced, whether it's theatre, whether it's dances, whether it is songs that were created in many languages, many of those songs can be sung now without much change. There's a huge range. So for example, I have found a Heer in Punjabi written about the Bengal famine. This was written by Sheila Bhatia, and it used to be sung by this person called Swatantrata Prakash, who lived in Delhi. So now it's a song which tells the story of a young woman who's lost everything in the famine, and she's she says, I'm running around like a mad woman. Who can I tell my sad story to? And again, when I collected it, I heard it from Swatantrata ji herself. And she actually told me the story of how it was performed at the peak of the Bengal famine. And it was something that was written in order also to reflect a certain kind of politics that was evolving between the government of Punjab and the government of Bengal at that time, which involved food transfers. So this is in Punjabi. Now this was not known at all till I met Swatantrata ji, and she actually talked about it, and she also gave me the lyrics, and then I reconstructed it because she wasn't able to sing. She just told me that it was a classic heer, and so I reconstructed it. So that's in Punjabi. There are Malayalam songs, there are Telugu songs. I've found songs in many languages, Bangla of course, and Hindi and Urdu. So
the range is massive.
yes, and these are only the ones that I know.
Right,
So I'm sure they must have been written in Gujarati, because Gujarat and Maharashtra were areas where the IPTA Central Squad toured extensively, to talk about the famine. So I'm sure there must have been songs written in
The
Marathi.
entire that Bhuka Hai Bengal program.
Yes, yes,
I think,
yeah. I mean, I know there were povadas written in Maharashtra. So, yeah, so, there's just this one particular
Right. So
event.
I think forms develop based on the language areas, depending on the states. And I think local forms were taken up.
Yeah,
and
local
then-
forms were taken up wherever they were
Right,
being created.
right. Would you want to sing 2 lines for us, possibly from any of the famine songs that you were talking about, or anything that you think would reflect possibly the form of these songs
Yeah.
and also the content which you spoke about all this while?
Okay, I'll sing the heer. I mean, just a little bit of the heer. This is a classic heer, and Sheila Bhatia used to write a lot of heers, and she used the heer a lot in her productions as well later on. And so she wrote this in Lahore, and at that time, at the peak of the famine, it as far as I know, it was performed once at a big Kisan Sabha rally. So, yeah. किनु फूल दसा दुख दर्द सैयो किनु फूल दसा दुख दर्द सैयो मेरा रोग ताला इलाज दिसे कर काट साई कनू छूटे मैं थो क्यों सवाल है बिना जवाब दिसे
Do you think gender played any role in these songs? Was there a liberty to think about?
This is a complex question, and it has also been a controversial issue, as you know.
Right.
Okay. If we look at it from today's standpoint, whether there was deep thinking on gender that was involved at every stage in the creation of whatever the IPTA created, perhaps not. In the sense that it's not as if a lot of the theoretical debates that we know of in more recent times were actually addressed in that way. But what does come across is that very large numbers of women artists were part of it. Okay, and these are people who actually left their homes.
Everything, their
Yeah, they left their
household,
homes. They were coming here to live very unusual lives
right.
in communes and so on.
Right.
And so what I've gathered from the interviews that I've done with a lot of the women of that period, that itself was actually quite transformatory from the point of view of a gender project for the men as well as the women who were involved. The very idea that young men and women can actually live in a commune and spend all their time together, and so to that extent there was, and in many parts of the country there were gender issues that were being taken up. So for example, as part of the peasant movement, there were in Telangana, I know a lot of the songs that were being written were looking at it from the point of view of women and work. Okay, so there are songs which actually are reflecting the labor process and the responsibility that women have. Okay, no, I don't, because I know there are. I mean, I have references to those songs, and I also know that there were debates around that, whether that should be performed. And sure enough, I mean, it's bound to be there. So for example, poems which roughly translated will say, "Plant a seed in barren land," and so on. The way the references are clear in terms of. It's not just about land, but it's also this whole idea of the role of the woman and so on. Work songs, women's work songs were very important. Now, the very idea that you actually talk about the women's work song long before discussions on gender and work actually start becoming part of the mainstream political discussion, according to me, would be an addressing of gender concerns. But where the patriarchy was being challenged very strongly, there are debates about all of this, and I think there are varied experiences. Individuals had particular kinds of experiences, and the relationship between culture and politics, and the second is the relationship between the cultural movement and the political movement, and sometimes these two have been different. So one. The first, which is on the relationship between culture and politics, I think the distinction really needs to be on culture in politics and culture as politics, and that's where very often there have been major debates, especially when it comes to its interpretation in organizational terms, and I wouldn't want to really say one is more important than the other. But what is perhaps much less important in political movements of the left, particularly, is this whole emphasis on culture as politics on its own. And in the earlier period, and I mean really one can talk about the period from the 1940s to say the late 1960s or so, the idea that culture is politics, even if it is something that exists in terms of certain boundaries defined by the boundaries of the political movement itself, was taken far more seriously. And then of course the big debates that it involved, Ritwik Ghatak's document, yes, on the role of the cultural movement, and not just him, but so many artists, the views within the cultural movements themselves, the views within political parties, all these are quite well known. But what it really boils down to, I think, is this whole question of what is culture as politics, and what is culture in politics. So then there's a whole range of issues that it involves. It involves form versus content. It involves the role of the cultural worker, the role of the political organization to which the cultural movement might be affiliated in determining the trajectory of the cultural movement. So all these have, they've been very big debates, as well as there have been variations in different parts of the world, and also within India there have been different kinds of strands. So it's certainly true, I think, that in more recent times the kind of more rounded view of the importance that culture has in a political movement has reduced, and it's something that has been relatively more linear in terms of its view, and culture has really become like a department of politics.
Because I have read about, you know, at least 5,000 people getting moved by just one song, possibly what
Mm.
speeches
Yeah.
couldn't do during IPTA times.
Mm.
I mean, even I think IPTA organizers or cultural workers were preparing their audiences also.
Mm.
They were, because I think the constant need for IPTA was to go back to their tradition. A similar kind of stress is found today also.
Hmm.
We are constantly told, go back to your traditions, and possibly not the roots of people, but the roots that are synthetically created for a kind of convenience, whose ever convenience it might be.
Hmm.
Now, when you say that still people are getting moved, which is a very positive thing for us to hear, that in the auditoria or the college students or these, not necessarily they are getting moved by recognizing their traditions per se, but possibly just listening to there's a kind of cathartic effect that happens when they listen to you singing. So, how do you think today, when you are singing, do you think today there is still a requirement to go back to the roots, to go back to the tradition and get to know these forms?
See, this is a difficult question to answer because what does it actually mean when we say go back to, are we looking for some notion of the authentic? Is there something called the authentic which is unmediated by time,
Exactly.
history,
Yeah.
technology,
Yeah.
and so on? So that's, I mean, I for one do not want to go into this question of authenticity. Having said that, however, I think all of us are located in some
Kind of, yeah.
in something which, if you want to use a sort of fancy sounding term, an oral imaginary. Okay, we are all located in a certain soundscape which we've grown up with and are exposed to, which involves multiple influences. And in a country where we still do sing a lot of our traditional music, whether or not it's authentic. People are used to all kinds of music and impulses which actually come from local cultures of various kinds. Now, it might be something that you've picked up in the place where you've grown up. It might be something that you pick up on the way much later. So there is that sensibility that builds up. And what actually really makes something effective, I think, as performance, is to be able to loop into that sensibility. And it's a complex sensibility. But at the same time, I mean, depending upon which place we are talking about, if you're performing in a place which is less influenced by, say, global trends, then it has to be a different sensibility that is tapped into.
Right.
And that's really what an effective artist would be able to do. To be able to actually, to herself possess that kind of an acuity, and also to be able to put that across to an audience and try and figure it out. So the art of performance really, which is the conversation that happens through your art with whoever is witnessing it, is a very complex combination of sensibilities. So within that, then of course tradition or whatever people have grown up with, or completely avant-garde or alien sounds might be what people respond to. So I don't know whether that's answering your question, but,
yeah.
So that is what really involves the dynamics of performance itself. So even an old repertoire which might have emerged in a particular time, the degree to which it can become effective in a much later period, of course, would depend upon
how you place it, possibly.
How you place it and how good it was to begin with.
Yeah.
Whether it was an interesting tune, what its lyrics meant, and conveyed, but also, what meaning can be sort of gleaned out of the old music in contemporary times, given people specific aesthetic locations.
What role does instruments play in these songs, the protest songs?
Yeah, well, very, very important role, because the instrument becomes the interpreter.
Right. Okay.
In some sense, I think across time. The voice does as well, but the instrument can actually completely change the way in which the song sounds.
Okay. What have you tried? I mean,
Yeah, so for example, there are many songs of the IPTA which would be performed from whatever one hears of old recordings using traditional instruments. So there are songs which use the sitar. Ravi Shankar, when he played, used to sitar a lot, but then the harmonium and tabla. And very often, if it was also theatre music, it would be using the idiom of the theatre, and also for travelling musicians to be able to travel with the tabla and harmonium and so on. Now, I haven't really worked much with the harmonium tabla kind of a combination with the IPTA songs, because I just wanted a different kind of a sound. And so I've worked with people who play the guitar, the cello, and various other instruments, and on occasions have also sung it in a more traditional kind of a format using the harmonium tabla.
So why did you choose this different set of instruments? It's just out of query.
Yeah, well, a little bit is because I'm fascinated by these instruments. And it was interesting for me to actually think of using instruments which can employ the Western harmonic system, which can give a different cadence when it is performed with an Indian tune. And that attracted me. So when I started working with people who play the guitar and with people who play the cello, for example, it was just a completely different interpretation for a tune which would sound very different if it was played
harmonium
and a tabla. So not to say that did not appeal, but just to be able to create a slightly different kind of a sound. And of course it was an experiment and it worked. It has largely worked.
It brings in an element of contemporary also.
It does. It does. And it also helps to destabilize a little bit, because the point of actually reworking an old tradition would not just be to play it back again and again, but to also
interpret it in your terms.
Interpret it and also destabilize very established kind of meanings. And that really does happen, I think, when you change the instrumentation, because the instrument then actually interprets things in different ways.
In the IPTA tradition, as far as my knowledge goes, I think it was, I don't know, you will be able to say better. It was only, I think, Sholil Chaudhary who used a lot of Western influences in his songs. We find a kind of harmony working. There's a chorus that comes to use, and there's a chorus which does the harmony in middle of the songs also. So this was one thing, and I remember that Hemangu Biswas also had a kind of debate with him in the Allahabad conference, where he said that you are getting too much pulled into formalism and you are not looking at the content per se, which should talk about people. So this is an example. So can you just give us few more examples from different parts where people have been influenced by different forms, and how these forms have worked in other parts, because you have archived songs from various parts of India. So hence the question.
Well, if we actually look at people working with Western forms, it's been mostly Bengal. I'm talking about the 40s and 50s. Bengal was really the place where people were working with.
Navajit Bonergan was also did have influences.
Yes, so in Bengal, with Pankaj Malik and Jyotirindra Moitra himself, they were working with Western instruments. But what Sholil Chaudhary did was to actually really bring in the structure of Western classical music into Indian music. So, and that, according to me, was a very major innovation, and which is perhaps one of the reasons why people accused him of too much formalism and so on. But it was a very important innovation. So, if you look at engaging with the Western idiom, really, it's been mostly Bengal in that period, and of course, a lot of it also got incorporated into choir singing in Bombay and in Madras. So the Madras Youth Choir, the Bombay Youth Choir got created with more or less the same kind of aims, let me put it, to start singing those kinds of songs. But there were translations and renditions of the Internationale from the 1920s onwards in many Indian languages. So there was the Internationale, which was sung in Urdu, in Hindi, in Telugu. But those are not strictly Western songs in that sense. So as far as the Western idiom was concerned, I think it was largely limited in terms of its of really working with it to Bengal. But as far as other influences are concerned, from your own influence, it was happening all over the place. Because and one of the places where this would become very apparent would be the national conferences of the IPTA. And the purpose of the national conference, apart from actually debating theoretical issues and so on, and organizational issues, was, I think, actually to be able to do this, and to be able to different parts of the country to other parts of the country. So it was actually quite commonplace for people to hear something in a conference and then go back and actually produce a song in a local language but using a tune from elsewhere. And there are many examples of this. Many examples of this. So Sholil Chaudhary's own song, which is called Man Bonai Bandhune, is actually a Telugu tune, and it was a peasant song from Andhra, which he picked up when they were traveling by train, and he converted it into a Bengali song. So this kind of thing was very, very common. So in Kerala, I found songs. P. Bhaskaran wrote a marching song, which was like Kadam Kadam Badhaya Ja. So this kind of mixing, borrowing, imitating was actually quite common.
So I think that in a way defines plurality, how it was represented in the IPTA movement as well. I think it is more than diversity, one would want to call it plurality. You have also worked with Safdar Hashmi, you have worked with Habib Tanveer. How do you think they were using songs in their theatre? Because they were using songs to a great extent, and they used it as a technique to place their theatre. And how effective was it?
Well, Safdar Hashmi was really the person through whom I got a sense of what the IPTA was. I'm not just Safdar Hashmi. I mean, I was with Parcham, Kajal Ghosh, and so working with both Kajal Ghosh and Safdar Hashmi very early on was the first time I started hearing about the IPTA songs. And so therefore, and Safdar was very involved with the IPTA Delhi, and so therefore he had quite a sort of extensive view about what the IPTA's work meant in theatre as well as in music. Now he himself wrote a lot of songs for the street plays that Jannati Manch did, which drew quite strongly from a particular kind of song that the IPTA tradition created, which was actually the agitprop song. So these were to a large extent folk tune based, but they were the kind of folk tunes which were not very complex and which could be sung by people who need not be expert singers, and which were popular, easily reproducible, and also could accommodate all kinds of lyrics. So for example, Safdar used to use the ala a lot in his in Jannati Manch's plays. So he wrote songs in plays which were which use the ala
Ala,
form.
yeah.
You know, talking about Habib Saab's music is something that can take up a lot of time. But he, I think, had one of the most amazing ways of understanding what we call folk and its use on stage.
On stage, yes.
And not just its use on stage in terms of it being an expression of something that was happening on stage, but in a very, very Brechtian sense of actually being the interpreter. So music in Habib Saab's plays very often is the interpreter of the story. It draws strongly from traditions that exist in classical or traditional Indian theatre forms, where people can, suddenly a group of people can come on stage and start singing something, but the whole Brechtian idea of actually telling the audience what is happening on stage used to be used brilliantly by Habib Saab. And one thing that I used to observe very carefully, of course I realized this all much later, was what that Brechtian technique actually meant in terms of how a tune gets created, whether that tune is similar to or different from the original folk tune that it might have come out of. Not just a folk tune, I mean, he used to use Tagore a lot, for example. He would just bring in a tiny little bit of change in a tune which would do the job of becoming the interpreter. So that skill, which can only come, according to me, out of a very, very intense aesthetic engagement and the ability to comprehend that aesthetics as politics. I mean, whatever work I did with Habib Saab, which was mostly in the form of watching him, spending a lot of time, was to just watch him write the lyrics and to watch not just him, but people in his in Naya Theatre, Devi Lal ji, for example, who used to create a lot of the music, create the tunes and how people sang it. A lot of questions of folk, tradition, politics, suddenly just started falling into place, just watching how he did it. And I think that has been the brilliance of his contribution to music. And of course, at the end of it, all of it sounded really good. It was lovely music.
How about working with Prasanna?
Plays in which I've worked with Prasanna were both in Hindi. And Prasanna himself doesn't come from a Hindi tradition, so he did not get very involved with what would happen in the music. I got initially involved with the music of Uttar Ramcharitra, which he was beginning to direct, but then I couldn't continue with it, and so perhaps that might have been a very different kind of an experience, but it was a more conventional kind of a relationship of being part of a cast.
Right.
Rather than in
Rather
terms
than
of music.
getting involved
Yeah.
musically.
Yeah.
Okay. So we would want to end it here, but with a song from you.
This is a song in Malayalam which was written in the 1940s. It's a love song, and it's a song that talks about a young peasant girl calling out to a green parakeet, saying, "Will you come and sing in my field? Will you come and sing in my banana grove? Will you come and sing the song that tickles the sickle that I hold in my hand?" Now this was actually sung by a choir worker called Medini in the 1940s, who's a brilliant singer even now in her 80s, and she taught me the song, and it's an example of a song which became hugely popular. I mean, she was known as the Green Parakeet, Pachapanantata, in the 1940s, and people used to come from really far to come and listen to her sing this song. And it was part of a play called Nammalonna, Viyavan, and this was written by somebody called Pongundam Damodaran. The music was most probably by Babu Raj, but this is not totally confirmed. Yeah. പച്ചപ്പനന്തത്തെ പൊന്നാര പൂമുത്തെ പൂനെല്ലിൻ പൂങ്കരളേ ഉച്ചയ്ക്കു നീ എൻ്റെ കൊച്ചു വാഴത്തോപ്പിൽ ഒന്നുവാ പൊന്നഴകേ പച്ചപ്പനന്തത്തെ പൊന്നാര പൂമുത്തെ പൂനെല്ലിൻ പൂങ്കരളേ ഉച്ചയ്ക്കു നീ എൻ്റെ കൊച്ചു വാഴത്തോപ്പിൽ ഒന്നുവാ പൊന്നഴകേ പച്ചപ്പനന്തത്തെ തെയ്യന്നം തെയ്യന്നം പാടണ പാടത്ത് നീ ഒന്നു പാടഴകേ തെയ്യന്നം തെയ്യന്നം പാടണ പാടത്ത് നീ ഒന്നു പാടഴകേ കൊയ്യുന്ന കൊയ്ത്തരി വാളിന്നു കിക്കിളി കൊള്ളുന്ന പാട്ടുപാട കൊള്ളുന്ന പാട്ടുപാട പച്ചപ്പനന്തത്തെ പൊന്നാര പൂമുത്തെ പൂനെല്ലിൻ പൂങ്കരളേ ഉച്ചയ്ക്കു നീ എൻ്റെ കൊച്ചു വാഴത്തോപ്പിൽ ഒന്നുവാ പൊന്നഴകേ പച്ചപ്പനന്തത്തെ